Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a year where summer just didn't happen.
Yeah.
June comes, and there are snowstorms in New England. Crops fail everywhere. It sounds like, science fiction.
It really does, but it actually happened in 1816.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for this deep dive, we're getting into the story of the Mount Tambora eruption back in 1815 and the incredible global effects it had. We're looking at eyewitness accounts and this really fascinating book about the year the world went dark.
It's quite something, isn't it? How one admittedly huge volcanic event could just set off this cascade of consequences across the entire planet.
Right.
Our goal here is really to connect the dots, to see how this massive ash cloud from, well, what was then the Dutch East Indies, triggered changes in weather, farming, politics, even culture, all in 1816.
Totally. And for you, our listener, you sent us these amazing historical documents, so get ready. We're going to sift through this and show just how linked up the world was, even way back then, and how vulnerable it was to something happening thousands of miles away. It's kind of mind-blowing.
It really is. So let's start at the epicenter, you could say, Tambora.
Okay,
it's on Sumbawa Island, part of the Dutch East Indies. And interestingly, at that time, the British, who were sort of temporarily in charge, weren't even sure they wanted to keep the island. Didn't see much value in it.
Which is ironic, given what happened. Okay, so the eruption itself, April 1815, it was huge.
Unbelievably huge. People on the island described explosions louder than anything they'd ever heard, and then just darkness. For days, dawn just didn't come.
Wow.
Ash buried everything, like up to 3 feet deep in some areas. Terrible loss of life, obviously. And the sea. The sea was clogged with miles of floating pumice and ash, like floating islands of debris.
Just devastating. It wasn't just local, right? You mentioned the sound travel.
Oh, yeah. The blasts were heard over 1,000 miles away on Sumatra. People there thought maybe villages were fighting each other initially.
That gives you a sense of the scale.
Definitely. And on Java, the sounds, the ash falling later, people interpreted it supernaturally. Some thought it was like divine cannons firing or leftover ammo from some sea spirit queen.
Wow. Okay. So spirits and cannons.
Yeah. Even days after the main blast, people in Java noted the ground was still shaking, the air was thick, hazy, couldn't see the sun properly, long periods of darkness.
So this is where it goes global, right? It's not just the ash falling nearby. It's what went up.
Exactly. The key is the sheer amount of sulfur dioxide that got blasted way, way up into the stratosphere.
Right.
We're talking millions of tons.
And up there, it changes.
Right. It reacts with other gases, hydroxide mainly, and forms sulfuric acid. Tiny, tiny droplets.
Yeah.
Over 100 million tons of it.
100 million tons.
Yeah, and these droplets form this massive aerosol cloud.
Like a haze, but way up high.
Precisely. Think of it like a sort of almost invisible veil high above the weather. And because the particles are so fine and so high up, rain doesn't wash them out easily.
Okay, so it just stays there.
It stays and it spreads. Those powerful stratospheric winds, the jet streams, they grab this cloud and whip it around the globe pretty quickly.
Oh.
So by the winter of 1815, 1816, this global veil is starting to reflect sunlight back into space.
Cooling things down.
Cooling things down and messing with the weather patterns everyone was used to. Big time.
Now, we should probably set the scene a bit, too. Like, what else was happening in the world? Because this wasn't happening in a vacuum.
Not at all. Europe was just coming out of, almost 20 years of the Napoleonic Wars, constant fighting.
Right. And Napoleon himself had just escaped from Elba, hadn't he? February 1815.
Exactly. Threw everyone into a panic. The leaders were all in Vienna trying to sort out a peace deal, and suddenly, Napoleon's back.
Yeah.
They declared him an enemy and disturber of the peace.
So there was this huge desire for peace, finally.
Oh, absolutely. People were exhausted by war. There was this real feeling of peace at any price almost. Everyone desperately wanted stability for the future.
And just as they're hoping for calm, bam! Nature throws this massive curveball.
Completely different kind of disruption, yeah. Unpredictable.
So the first real signs of this volcanic impact,
Yeah.
they started showing up that winter, 1815-16. But not everywhere.
Kind of patchy at first. Central Italy, Hungary, they had a really cold winter, lots of snow, unusual amounts.
Okay.
But interestingly, North America, pretty mild winter, actually. Not many complaints recorded at the time.
So it wasn't instantly obvious everywhere.
No, the effects were varied initially, but then spring 1816 rolled around, especially in North America, and things started getting weird.
Wow.
Well, late April, people in America started noticing this huge sunspot. Really big, apparently. You could see it without a telescope, just with the naked eye.
A giant sunspot.
Okay.
And this got people thinking. because, the sun equals heat, right? And this was also during something called the Dalton minimum.
Dalton minimum?
Yeah, what happened?
That sounds important. It was basically a period when the sun was known to be less active, fewer sunspots overall. So when this massive one appeared during a generally quiet time, some people jumped to the conclusion, that's blocking the sun's heat. That's why it's getting cold.
Okay, so the sunspot theory pops up early. Makes intuitive sense, I guess.
It did to some, but others were skeptical. And actually, the real driver, we now understand, was likely the effect of that aerosol cloud on the atmosphere, specifically the jet stream.
Right, the volcanic cloud. How did that affect the jet stream?
Well, the cloud way up there likely weakened the polar vortex. That's the big circulation of cold air normally locked up around the pole.
Okay.
When the vortex weakens, the jet stream, that fast river of air separating cold polar air from warmer air further south, it starts to wobble. It develops these big, deep loops.
Like a meandering river, but in the sky.
Exactly. And these big southward loops allowed frigid Arctic air to plunge much further south than usual, and these patterns could get stuck for long periods.
Leading to prolonged cold spells in places that shouldn't be cold.
Precisely. Oh. And the consequences started showing up dramatically in the spring of 1816. May saw these late frosts across New England, killing off fruit blossoms.
Oh.
Albany, New York had snow and temperatures like it was March. Even down in Trenton, New Jersey, they had a really bad black frost, which is particularly damaging. Virginia, Pennsylvania, right. Crops were hit hard there too. A guy writing in Maine just said, pretty bluntly, that by the end of May, everything had been killed by the cold.
Everything killed by the cold?
In May, yeah. But May was just the warm-up act, unfortunately.
What could be worse than May frosts?
June. Snowstorms.
No, snow in June?
Seriously. After a fairly warm start to April, things just went downhill. Early June saw these wild temperature swings, warm one day, freezing the next.
Okay.
And then the snow. Quebec, Montreal.
Yeah.
They got snow. Vermont got hit really hard. Places like Cabot reported a foot, maybe 18 inches. Montpelier got nearly a foot. Danville had drifts up to 20 inches.
18 inches of snow.
Yeah.
In June. In Vermont.
Yeah. And along the coast, New England saw freezing temperatures at night right through June. Even further south, Pittsburgh, Ohio, hard frosts damaging the fruit trees that had somehow survived May.
People must have been completely bewildered.
Utterly. You see it in the diaries and newspapers. Phrases like, never before, strange weather. They had absolutely no frame of reference for summer snow.
Which makes sense, given the science of the time, right? They couldn't really explain it.
Not really, no. Weather records were patchy, mostly just personal notes. People like Thomas Jefferson tried doing coordinated observations, but it was isolated.
And the instruments were still pretty basic.
Relatively. They had barometers, thermometers. Daniel had just invented a better hygrometer for humidity. But collecting data systematically, understanding global patterns, that was still a long way off.
So they didn't grasp how the atmosphere worked on a global scale.
Not really. They had some early ideas about wind patterns, like the Hadley cell theory, but understanding Earth's rotation, how that affects things, it was tough.
Yeah.
And the idea that a volcano on the other side of the world could cause snow in Vermont, that just wasn't on the scientific radar at all.
So with no clear science, people started looking elsewhere for answers.
Exactly. That's sunspot theory. It made a comeback when June turned so cold, people thought maybe it is the sun.
What else did they come up with?
There was a theory about ice. Huge amounts of ice reported in the Great Lakes and the North Atlantic. Some figured maybe the ice was just sucking all the heat out of the air.
Okay. Plausible.
Well, critics pointed out that if that were true, shouldn't the areas right next to the ice be even colder? And that wasn't always the case, so maybe not.
And you get the more dramatic theories.
Inevitably. With such bizarre weather, earthquakes happening, disease outbreaks, some people started connecting the dots and thinking, this is it, the end times are here. Apocalyptic fears definitely surfaced.
That seems like a common reaction to the inexplicable back then.
Very much so. Interestingly, you also had some thinkers in America suggesting maybe deforestation was to blame.
Deforestation?
How? The idea was that clearing forests changed how the ground absorbed heat, maybe made things colder, or allowed northerly winds to blow stronger. People like Leavitt, Thomas, Dunbar proposed this.
Was there anything to that?
Forests certainly impact local climate, but the link to large-scale, cold, and stronger winds like this, not really supported by evidence, especially on this scale.
And there's always divine intervention.
Oh, absolutely. For many, that was the ultimate explanation. This weird, damaging weather had to be God's will, maybe a punishment, a call for repentance.
Right.
You see a Vermont newspaper quoting the Bible to explain the frost. A farmer in Connecticut just writing in his diary, "Great frost, we must learn to be humble."
Wow. So just a whole spectrum of attempts to make sense of it all.
From sunspots to God's will, yeah. It really shows the uncertainty and the fear people were feeling.
And this wasn't just about weird weather, was it? It had real impacts on people's lives, their livelihoods, especially in the U.S.
Absolutely. The timing was tough. The U.S. was just coming out of the War of 1812. There was this sense of optimism, the era of good feelings, they called it.
And this hits.
Right. Agriculture was still very local. People depended on what they grew nearby. Transportation wasn't great. You couldn't easily ship food long distances if crops failed in one region.
So a bad harvest meant immediate hardship.
Immediate and severe, yeah. And while the cold wasn't equally bad everywhere, the overall disruption to farming was huge across large parts of the country.
Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europe's having its own problems.
Definitely. Paris had a cold, wet spring. France was politically fragile, trying to deal with Louis VIII being back on the throne after Napoleon.
And Britain.
Britain was facing serious economic hardship, high unemployment after the wars, food prices soaring. This led to demands for better wages, cheaper food. Riots broke out.
Riots over food.
Yeah, people were desperate. They started destroying new farm machines they blamed for taking jobs. In Norfolk, there were these big protests, people marching with signs saying, "Bread or blood." It was tense.
Bread or blood. That's intense. Shows the desperation.
It really does. And the cold hit there, too. A cold wave in May damaged plants. It just compounded the existing problems.
Even the arts seemed to reflect the mood, didn't they?
Yeah.
You mentioned the Shelleys and Byron in Switzerland.
Right. They were stuck indoors because of the relentless rain and cold. That's when they had those famous ghost story sessions at Byron's villa.
And Mary Shelley started writing Frankenstein then.
Exactly. Amidst all that gloom and weird weather, it kind of fits, doesn't it? The atmosphere must have been incredibly unsettling. Byron wrote poems about the darkness, too, the despair.
So as summer wore on, the farm situation got worse.
Much worse. Reports from New England were just dire. Corn failed, hay crops were ruined, vegetables wiped out. People in New Hampshire, Massachusetts were genuinely starting to fear famine.
Famine in the U.S.
The fear was real. And you see similar worries elsewhere. Raffles, the British governor in Java, was sending out inquiries, trying to figure out how Tambora had affected crops there.
Right. Back near the source.
And in England, things were described as just miserable. You had groups like the Bilston Colliers marching hundreds of miles to plead for help because they were starving.
God, that's grim.
Britain's summer was just relentlessly cold and wet. Temperatures stayed way down. Hay, clover, ruined. They started worrying about the wheat harvest, which was crucial. People were even killing livestock because there was no food for them.
Killing their own animals.
Because they couldn't feed them. And across Europe, food shortages, prices skyrocketing. The Rhine flooded massively, adding to the misery. They were handing out charity soup, like Rumford soup, just to keep people alive in some places.
All this chaos. It must have fueled those apocalyptic fears even more.
Oh, definitely. Prophecies about the end of the world spread like wildfire, often tied back to the weird weather, the sunspots reappearing. Newspapers tried to calm people down, but the fear was tangible.
Any specific examples?
There was some prophet in Italy whose predictions caused mass panic. People stopped working. Scotland had this terrifyingly dark storm that scared everyone senseless. And some working guy in France apparently declared himself a prophet, saying the end was nigh.
People were desperate for answers. And maybe for some, the end of the world seemed like one.
Perhaps, or just overwhelmed by events they couldn't control or understand.
And when things get that bad, people move, right? Migration.
That became a major response, yeah. We have the story of the Smith family in Vermont. Joseph Smith, who later founded the Mormon Church, was a boy then. His family had terrible harvests 3 years running, culminating in 1816. They finally just gave up and moved west to New York.
Looking for better land, better luck.
Exactly. And Ireland. Ireland was hit incredibly hard.
Why Ireland particularly?
It already had huge problems. Rapidly growing population, heavy dependence on farming, especially potatoes. The Napoleonic Wars had already messed with food supplies, land tenure issues, poverty. It was a tough situation already.
And then this weather hits.
Catastrophic. Tenant farmers, laborers, they were pushed into extreme poverty, led to a lot of social unrest, faction fighting, things like that. Just immense hardship.
So even people who weren't freezing or starving directly were affected by the ripple effects. like Jane Austen.
Yeah, the thinking is the persistent, damp, cold weather might have worsened her health problems. She was already unwell. And J.M.W. Turner, the painter, he was traveling in northern England that summer, sketching amidst constant rain. His paintings from that time often have this dramatic, stormy atmosphere.
You can almost see the weather in the air.
You really can. Lady Shelley, Percy's mother, was also in Switzerland and wrote about seeing snow in the middle of summer. Just bizarre. Even Byron was complaining about the awful weather and all the miserable-looking English tourists flocking there.
Huh? Even Lord Byron was fed up with the tourists.
Apparently so.
And politically, the unrest kept simmering.
Yeah. Back in the U.S., President Madison held his Independence Day party, but everyone knew things were bad, worried about the harvest. Public anger started showing up in early congressional elections. People were unhappy.
They wanted change.
They wanted solutions, yeah. In Britain, the food riots continued. There's a story about a big cake distribution in London, maybe an attempt to just distract people from the real problems of hunger and poverty.
The literal let them eat cake moment, almost.
Sort of feels that way, doesn't it?
Did things get any better as summer ended? Any relief?
There was a brief warm spell in the U.S. in August. People probably thought, okay, finally. But then, bam, another sharp cold front swept through. More frost damage, especially up north. Fears of famine grew in places like Quebec.
Just relentless.
Pretty much. Europe wasn't faring much better. Portugal's king was still over in Brazil. Spain was a political mess. Crops were damaged across Spain and Portugal. France had elections, but that didn't fix the harvest. Britain got hit by severe storms and even snow again in late September.
Snow in September. After snow in June.
Yeah.
Ruined whatever was left of the harvest. People like James Mill were making really gloomy predictions about Britain's future. Geneva, Brussels, food shortages, high prices everywhere.
In Ireland.
Still desperate. Daniel O'Connell wrote about the widespread poverty and misery, just dire.
So autumn just brought more hardship.
Afraid so. New England reports were alarming, crop failures, not enough hay or fodder for animals. Then, because it had been cold and wet, followed by maybe some dry spells, devastating forest fires broke out in Maine.
Fires after the cold and wet.
Yeah, drought conditions could follow sometimes. Grain prices kept climbing. Farmers faced awful choices. And that westward migration from New England, it really picked up pace. People were leaving in droves.
Just packing up and heading west.
Looking for a better chance. Ireland just got wetter and colder. Crops failed again. The government tried some relief efforts. Robert Peel was involved, but it was a massive crisis.
And disease follows famine, right?
Yeah.
Tragically, yes. Switzerland saw widespread famine. And in Ireland, a huge typhus epidemic broke out, spreading rapidly among the weakened, malnourished population. Food riots and protests continued across Britain and Europe as prices stayed high.
So that winter, 1816 into 17, must have been just awful.
A real winter of discontent, as they say. President Madison, in his last speech to Congress, specifically mentioned the unfavorable seasons. Political fights continued in the U.S. Monroe won the presidency, but Congress saw a huge turnover. Voters were clearly angry.
People wanted change at the top.
Seems like it. John Quincy Adams, who was in Britain, noted the continuing poverty and hardship there. Emigration from New England kept going strong. Native American communities also suffered badly from the disrupted environment and lack of resources.
And people were still trying to figure out why.
Still grasping. Theories about electrical fluid in the air or giant icebergs drifting further south than usual.
Yeah.
Anything to explain the persistent cold.
So looking back, what are the big takeaways from this whole year without a summer?
Well, the hardship didn't just vanish in 1817. It lingered. The social unrest, the political changes, they were definitely linked to this massive climate shock. But importantly, it also nudged science forward. People started investigating the link between volcanoes and climate much more seriously later on.
So Tambora became a kind of grim case study.
Exactly. It confirmed, eventually, that major eruptions can have global climate impacts. The year without a summer really stands out in history as proof of how connected our planet is and how vulnerable societies can be to these large-scale natural events.
So wrapping this up, Tambora in 1815 wasn't just some local tragedy. It kicked off this global chain reaction in 1816, environmental, social, economic, political.
Yeah.
It really highlights how fragile things were, how interconnected everything was, even 200 years ago. One volcano could darken the world.
Absolutely. And for you listening, you brought us these documents, and digging into them shows this vivid picture of a world thrown into chaos by climate change, essentially. Natural climate change, but change nonetheless.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, of how vulnerable we can be, how linked our world is.
Definitely.
And here's something to think about, maybe. How would an event like Tambora play out today? We have satellites, global communication, better science, but we also have, a much more complex, interconnected global economy, massive populations reliant on global supply chains.
That's a really interesting question. Would our technology make us more resilient, or would our interconnectedness actually make us more vulnerable to certain kinds of disruption?
Right. What lessons from 1816 still hold true? Looking back at how people coped, the explanations they sought, the societal fractures, it gives you a different lens for thinking about our own challenges today, doesn't it?
It really does. History offering perspective, maybe even warnings for the present.